The Volkai did not believe in warnings. In the 600 years since their first warship broke through their own atmosphere and touched the cold silence of space, they had found 41 worlds with life on them. 41 chances to learn something new, to reach across the dark and say hello. They had destroyed every single one. Not because they were cruel, or at least, not only because of that, but because their oldest law, carved into the first stone tablets of their ancestors, said one simple thing: consume before you are consumed. Fleet Admiral Surek stood at the forward observation deck of the Eternal Dominion, the largest warship ever built by his people. It was 3 kilometers long. Its hull was the color of a bruised, dark purple-gray, and its engines burned with the quiet, steady light of something that had never once been asked to stop. Around it, in every direction that Surek could see through the thick transplaz viewport, were ships. Thousands of them. They moved in perfect formation through the black, like a school of enormous fish, each one carrying weapons that could crack a continent. Surek was not a man who felt things deeply. He had not felt nervous in 30 years, but he did feel something as the target star, a yellow, unremarkable thing the prey species called Sol, grew slowly brighter on the horizon. He felt hungry. "Report," he said. His sensor officer, a young Volkai named Thesek, tapped the console in front of her and read without looking up. "Sol system, 1 star, 8 planets. The 3rd planet designation Sol III is the target. Atmosphere, breathable, surface water 70%, population, estimated 8 billion, electromagnetic signature consistent with a pre-interstellar civilization." She paused. "No orbital weapons platforms, no defensive grid, no warship signatures." Surek clasped his hands behind his back. "None." "None, Admiral. The most advanced objects in orbit are communication satellites and a handful of scientific stations. One of the stations carries 2 or 3 humans. That is all." The bridge was quiet for a moment, and then several officers laughed. It was a soft sound, almost embarrassed, the way you laugh when you realize the thing you were nervous about is actually nothing at all. Surek allowed himself a small smile. "How long to engagement range?" "At current speed, 9 hours. "Good." He turned away from the viewport and walked back toward his command chair, a heavy, angular thing bolted to the center of the bridge. "Signal the fleet. Standard approach formation. No preliminary bombardment. I want the agricultural zones intact. We will need the soil." He sat down and folded his long fingers together. "And no warning transmission. There is no point." Thesek nodded and began sending the signals. It was, from a purely military standpoint, a reasonable decision. The Volkai had done this 61 times now. 61 worlds. The procedure was well understood. Survey drones went in first, mapping the surface, counting the population centers, identifying the resource deposits. Then the fleet approached. Then the fleet fired. Then, after a few days of cleanup, the colonization ships came and the real work began. Sol III was just the 62nd. The survey data was sitting in Thesek's console, transmitted back by a drone that had passed through the system 8 months ago. She had read it twice on the journey here, mostly out of professional habit. The prey species called themselves humans. They had a complicated and somewhat violent history, wars among themselves mostly, over land and religion and resources. They had managed, somehow, not to destroy their own planet in the process, which was more than several other species had managed. Their technology was not nothing. They had nuclear weapons, chemical industries, and a rudimentary understanding of rocketry. They had sent small robotic probes to the edges of their own solar system. None of it mattered. A civilization that could not reach the stars under its own power could not defend itself from those who could. That was the law. That was always the law. What Thesek did not flag in her formal report, because it seemed too minor to mention, too strange to classify, was one small detail from the drone's deep scan reading. The drone had passed through the Sol system measuring everything: atmospheric composition, radio transmissions, Tectonic activity, ocean temperatures. The ocean temperatures were slightly warm, not dangerously so. Just a few degrees above what you would expect from the distance to the star and the greenhouse content of the atmosphere. She had almost written it up as a sign of industrial pollution. She had almost written it as evidence of the species' environmental carelessness, something to note for the colonial planners who would need to manage the soil chemistry later. In the end, she had not included it at all. It was too small. There were 1,000 other things to report. She did not know, and would not know for 9 more hours, that she had just looked directly at the most important fact in the entire solar system and decided it was not worth mentioning. The fleet moved on. On the third planet, in a windowless room buried 40 meters beneath the granite bedrock of the Nigerian highlands, a woman named Dr. Amara Osai sat in front of a bank of screens and watched a number change. The number was a contact count. 18 hours ago it had been 0. Then it had jumped to 1, a gravity-wake reading from the Uit cloud monitoring station at the edge of the solar system. A faint but unmistakable signature that meant something very large was moving very fast in the direction of the sun. The station's AI had flagged it automatically, piped it through 6 layers of encrypted relay, and delivered it to this room before most of the world's governments had finished their morning briefings. Now the number was 4,300 and climbing, as the Deep Field Observatory stitched together a picture from faint gravitational lensing. Each count was a ship. Amara had been waiting for this number for 11 years, not eagerly, not with any of the dark excitement that some of her colleagues had joked about in the early days of the program, back when the whole thing still felt theoretical, back when "if they come" was still a sentence people finished with a laugh. She had waited the way you wait for a diagnosis you already know is bad, quietly, with your hands flat on the table, trying to breathe normally. She picked up the red handset beside her left elbow and entered a 12-digit authentication code. The line connected in under a second. "This is Osai," she said. "Contact confirmed. Fleet scale incursion. Time to inner system, 9 hours. I am initiating protocol Omega Black." There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice, calm, careful, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in their head, said, "Authorization confirmed. God help us." "God had nothing to do with this part," Amara said. "We did." She set the handset down and turned back to her screens. In the next 4 minutes, 17 other buried facilities on 6 different continents received the same signal. They were not military bases in any traditional sense. There were no flags outside them, no guards in visible uniforms, no satellite dishes pointing at the sky. They were listed in government records as geological research stations, deep-sea cable maintenance depots, and in one case, a very boring agricultural data archive in rural Manitoba. Each one of them had a staff of between 12 and 40 people. Each one of them had, beneath the mundane surface layer of their cover, a direct hardwired connection to the largest secret humanity had ever kept. Amara pulled up a second screen. It showed a schematic, not of this room, but of the planet, or rather, of what was underneath the planet, and in the oceans around it, and in the deep craters of the moon, and tucked into the rocky bellies of asteroids that had been quietly hollowed out over the past 23 years and repurposed without anyone outside the program ever knowing. She looked at the schematic for a moment the way you might look at a thing you built with your own hands, over a very long time, and hoped would never be needed. 14,862 ships. That was the number, the true number, the number that had been built in silence, piece by piece, reactor by reactor, hull plate by hull plate in the dark places of the solar system for 31 years. Crews trained in underground simulators, weapons tested in the outer asteroid belt, far enough from any telescope that the flashes would look like minor impacts. Supply chains buried so deep in legitimate industrial records that 3 separate intelligence agencies, including 2, that did not officially know each other existed, had audited them and found nothing unusual. Humanity had looked at what happened to the Pelhari, had watched, through long-range instruments, the light of an entire civilization going dark, and had made a decision. Not a loud decision. Not a decision announced to the public or debated in any parliament or congress that kept records. A quiet decision, made by a small number of people in a series of rooms very much like this one, over the course of several very long, very serious conversations. The decision was this: if they ever come, we will be ready. We will not look ready, but we will be ready. And now they were coming. Amara watched the contact count on her left screen. She watched the schematic on her right screen. She thought briefly about her daughter, who was 12 years old and currently asleep in a house in Abuja, 20 minutes from here by car. She thought about the Pelhari, whose language she had spent 6 years learning from fragments, whose last transmission she had translated word by word, whose final messages to each other as the Vaokai fleet closed in had been, mostly, expressions of love. She thought about all of that, and then she set it aside because there was work to do. She began entering the activation sequences. One by one, in the dark beneath the oceans, beneath the mountains, beneath the ancient silent craters of the moon, things that had never been turned on began to wake up. The fleet was 9 hours away. It would not find what it expected. On the Eternal Dominion, Thesek's console chimed softly. She glanced at it. The deep scan thermal relay from the system's outer monitoring buoys was showing something odd. A slight increase in geothermal output from Sol-II's ocean floors. She frowned at the reading, then at the number beside it, then at the timestamp confirming it was not a sensor error. She started to type up a note. Then Admiral Surek's voice came from across the bridge, asking her something about the approach vector, and she minimized the window and answered and forgot about it. The fleet moved on through the dark. 8 hours and 51 minutes to go. The first thing Thesek noticed was that the readings did not stop. That was the thing about sensor anomalies, real ones, the kind caused by equipment drift or cosmic ray interference or a loose calibration relay somewhere in the console's backend. They spiked and then they settled. They made a shape on the graph like a mountain, up, peak, back, down. Every sensor officer learned that in the first week of training. Anomalies were not sustained. They were moments. What Thesek was looking at had been going on for 2 hours now, and it was not settling. It was growing. She had not told Admiral Surek yet. This was partly because she was not certain what she was looking at, and partly because Surek was the kind of commanding officer who did not appreciate uncertainty. He appreciated conclusions. He appreciated reports that began with a clear statement of fact and ended with a clear statement of implication. What Thesek had right now was neither. What she had was a column of numbers that kept getting larger, attached to a phenomenon she could not yet name. The ocean floors of Sol-II were warm. That had been in the original drone survey, but they were warmer now than they had been 8 months ago. Not by a catastrophic margin, not the kind of warmth that suggested volcanic activity or a runaway atmospheric event. Just warmer, steadily, consistently, in a pattern that was not random. Thesek pulled up the distribution map and stared at it. The warmth was not spread evenly across the ocean floors, the way geothermal heat would be. Geothermal heat came up through fault lines and volcanic ridges. It followed the cracks in the planet's crust, the seams where tectonic plates ground against each other. This warmth was not doing that. It was coming up in clusters. Specific locations, evenly distributed, separated from each other by distances that were far too regular to be geological. She counted the clusters. She counted them again because the first number did not seem right. 412 separate thermal sources on the ocean floors alone. She switched to the polar readings. The ice sheets of both poles were showing similar signatures, not on the surface but deep beneath, where the ice was old and dark and had not seen light in 100,000 years. Another 61 sources there. She switched to the continental deep scan. Another 207, buried in the rock at depths between 30 and 200 meters. Her console showed her a schematic of the planet with all the sources plotted. It looked like a rash. A perfectly even, perfectly spaced rash, covering the entire world. Thesek sat back in her chair and pressed her fingertips together, and thought very carefully about what she was going to say. In the end, she decided to say something, even if it was not a conclusion. She stood up from her station and walked across the bridge to where Surek sat. "Admiral," she said, "I need to show you something." He looked at her with the particular expression he reserved for interruptions he had not requested. "Is it relevant to the approach?" "I think it might be." He said nothing, which she had learned to interpret as permission. She handed him the data pad with the schematic on it. He looked at it. He looked at the numbers beside it. He looked at the distribution map. "What is this?" he said. "Thermal sources, sir. Beneath the surface of the target world. 412 in the oceans, 61 in the polar ice, 207 on the continents." "Geothermal?" "No, sir. The distribution pattern is wrong for geological activity. The spacing is too regular, and the depth profile is inconsistent. Some of these are only 30 meters below the surface. Natural heat sources don't sit that shallow without surface expression." Surek studied the map for another long moment. "Industrial?" "Possibly, but human industry leaves a different signature. Factories and power plants show up on surface scans, not buried scans. These are underground, all of them." She paused. "Sir, I have been trying to match this pattern against our database of known civilizational signatures, and I cannot find a match. It doesn't look like a power grid. It doesn't look like a mining operation. It looks like..." She stopped. "Like what?" Surek said. "I don't know what it looks like," she admitted. "That's why I came to you." Surek handed the datapad back to her. His expression had not changed. His expression almost never changed. "Continue monitoring. Alert me if the numbers increase significantly." He looked back at the viewport. "We are 6 hours out. Whatever those readings are, they will not matter when the bombardment begins." Thesek nodded and went back to her station. She watched the numbers. They kept going up. 31 years earlier, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Geneva that no longer existed under that name, 9 people had sat around a table and decided the shape of the future. They had not been elected to this. They had not been appointed by any committee or senate or council. They had been chosen by each other over the course of 2 years of careful, quiet conversation, because each of them had the same 2 qualities. They understood what was coming, and they were not afraid to do something enormous about it. The meeting had lasted 11 hours. There were no phones in the room. There were no recording devices. There was coffee, which ran out after the 3rd hour, and there was water, and there were 9 people looking at a photograph. The photograph had been taken by a deep space telescope array operated jointly by 3 countries whose names do not matter here. It showed, in false color infrared, the remains of what had been, until 14 months before the photograph was taken, a living world. The planet was called, in the fragmentary language of the species that had lived on it, something that translated roughly to the warm place. The species that had lived on it called themselves the Pelhari. They had been a quiet, curious, ocean-going civilization at roughly the same technological level as late 20th century Earth. They had not had space travel. They had not had weapons capable of reaching beyond their own atmosphere. The Vaukai had found them 40 years ago. The Vaukai had given them no warning. The photograph showed what was left. The 9 people around the table had all seen the photograph before the meeting. They had been selected partly because they could look at it without flinching. They looked at it again at the beginning of the meeting for exactly 1 minute by agreement, and then they turned it face down on the table and did not look at it again. They did not need to. It was in all of their heads already. The woman at the head of the table had been a naval architect. Her name was Dr. Ingrid Sahlberg, and she was 62 years old, and she had spent the previous 4 years working up the preliminary designs for what she called, in her private notebooks, the real fleet. Not the ships that governments built and flew flags on and showed to journalists. The other ships, the ones that would never be in a parade. She had begun the meeting by saying, "We know they are coming. We do not know when. We have, at best estimate, between 20 and 50 years. I want to talk about how we spend those years." What followed was the longest and most consequential conversation in human history, and almost no one would ever know it happened. They had argued about everything, about whether secrecy was even possible at the scale they were imagining, about whether governments could be trusted with any piece of it, about whether the psychological weight of keeping something this large hidden from the public, from families, from history, was a burden that would eventually break the program from the inside, about whether humanity even deserved to survive, given everything. And that argument had ended quickly because surviving and deserving to survive were not the same question, and only one of them was on the agenda. In the end, they had agreed on 3 things. First, the fleet would be built in secret, using a network of legitimate industrial contracts as cover, with no single contractor ever knowing more than their own piece of the whole. Second, the fleet would not be used offensively, ever. If humanity survived the first contact, the fleet would be stood down to a defensive posture. They were not building an empire. They were building a door with a very large lock. Third, if the worst happened and they lost, if the fleet was not enough, then at minimum the Pelhari would be remembered. Someone would make sure of that. It was a small thing in the scale of what they were planning, but Dr. Sahlberg had insisted on it, and nobody had argued. And so it had been written into the founding charter of the program in plain language, the only plain language in a document otherwise full of technical specifications and legal camouflage. We will remember those who were not remembered. The program had been running for 31 years when Thesek looked at her console and saw the thermal clusters and could not find a match in the database. It had been running for 31 years, and it was ready. Rear Admiral Yemi Ademi was 54 years old and had never commanded a ship in combat. This was not unusual among the senior officers of the Quiet, which was what the people inside the program called it. The Quiet had no combat record. It had never fired a weapon in anger. It had run 10,000 simulations, trained its crews in underground facilities that mimicked zero gravity and vacuum and the specific terror of a hull breach, and had conducted live-fire weapons tests in the deep asteroid belt under cover of mining operations. But it had never fought. Ademi thought about that sometimes. She thought about it now, sitting in the command center buried beneath the Nigerian highlands, watching the activation sequences run on the screen in front of her. The screens showed ship after ship coming online. Not on the surface. Not anywhere visible. In the ocean trenches, vast doors were sliding open in the rock, doors that had been closed for so long that coral and deep-sea organisms had grown over them, and were now falling away into the dark water as the doors moved for the first time. In the polar ice, chambers were venting stored atmosphere, and the magnetic signatures of powered-up reactors were beginning to appear on the sensors. In the lunar craters, dust was shifting as launch bays that had never launched anything depressurized and prepared. It was the largest simultaneous military activation in human history, and it was completely silent on the surface of the Earth. No sirens, no visible movement. The sky above every city on the planet looked exactly the same as it always did. People were going to work. Children were going to school. Somewhere in Abuja, Amara Osai's 12-year-old daughter was eating breakfast and complaining about a homework assignment, and had no idea that the most important day in the history of her species had already started. Adami had a daughter too. She did not let herself think about that right now. She watched the readiness indicators fill in one by one. Green, green, green. Across the board, across the fleet, across 14,862 ships, green. She had one job now, one decision to make, and then many smaller decisions after it. But the first one was simple. It was the one they had always called the permission. She leaned forward in her chair and spoke clearly into the room's primary microphone, because she wanted the recording to be clean. History, she had always believed, deserved clean recordings. All wings, she said, all commands, all stations, this is Rear Admiral Adami, authentication code follows. She read the code from the card in her left hand, then she set the card down. The fleet is authorized to begin emergence. Weapons free on my second order only. Do not fire until I give the word. She paused. Let them see us. The room around her was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then every screen on every console in the command center lit up simultaneously as 14,000 ships began to move. On the Eternal Dominion, Thesek's console screamed. Not literally. The alarm was a low, pulsing tone, the kind reserved for high-priority sensor events. She had never heard it in a real engagement before, only in training. Her hands moved to the console automatically, the way trained hands do. The data coming in made no sense. The thermal signatures on Sol-II were spiking, not gradually, all at once, simultaneously, like someone had thrown a switch. Every one of the clusters she had been tracking was suddenly blazing on her display, and new ones were appearing faster than her console could label them. She watched the contact count spin upward. 1,000, 2,000. She opened her mouth to report to Surek. Then the first contacts broke the surface of the ocean. They came up through the water like something prehistoric. Enormous dark shapes rising from the deep water streaming off hulls that had never seen sunlight, drives igniting as they cleared the surface and hit atmosphere. They were not sleek the way the Volkai ships were sleek. They were built for endurance, not elegance. Thick-hulled, heavily armored, their weapons systems already extending as they climbed through the clouds. Thesek's voice came out very quietly. "Admiral," she said, "contact." Surek was beside her in 4 steps. He looked at her screen. He looked at the contact count. He looked at the visual feeds from the forward sensor drones showing the shapes rising from the water, from the ice, now from the lunar surface. She could see the moon feeds in the corner of her display, dozens of ships launching from craters, catching the sunlight for the first time. "How many?" Surek said. It did not come out as a question. Thesek looked at the number on her screen. "I cannot get an accurate count," she said. "The system cannot display them all at once." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later when she thought back on this moment. "Rough estimate based on thermal signatures and drive outputs." She stopped. She looked at the number again. "Admiral, rough estimate is between 12 and 16,000 vessels." The bridge was absolutely silent. Surek stared at the screen for a long time. The contact count was still climbing. On the visual feeds, the sky above the blue planet was beginning to fill with shapes, dark against the cloud cover, rising steadily, taking formation with a calm and practiced precision that was, somehow, the most frightening thing Thesek had ever seen. They were not scrambling. They were not panicked. They were rising into position the way a military force rises into position when it has rehearsed this exact moment 10,000 times and is not surprised by any of it. Surek's voice, when it finally came, was very quiet. "Get me a full tactical picture," he said. "And get me a weapons lock-on." "Admiral?" Thesek interrupted him, which she had never done before in 4 years of serving on his bridge. She pointed at the secondary screen where a new signal had appeared, a transmission coming from the planet. "They're hailing us." Surek looked at the transmission indicator. He looked at the 14,000 ships arranging themselves in the space between his fleet and their world. He looked at the contact count, which had stopped climbing now, not because there were no more ships, but because the sensors had reached their display limit and were simply showing a ceiling. He said nothing for a moment. Then on screen, the face that appeared was human. A woman, middle-aged, with dark skin and short hair, and an expression of complete and total calm. She was wearing a plain dark uniform with no decoration on it except a small insignia at the collar. Behind her was a room full of screens and people working quietly at consoles. She looked at Surek directly, the way someone looks at a person they have been expecting for a very long time. When she spoke, her words came in perfect Volcae, with no accent. "You have entered the defended space of the human species," she said. "Withdraw, and this encounter ends here." Admiral Surek had conquered 12 worlds personally. He had been on the bridge for all 12 of them. He had watched the bombardments begin from the same chair he was sitting in now, had listened to the same sounds, the low hum of charging weapons, the clipped voices of his officers reading targeting data, the soft vibration in the floor that meant the drives were pushing the fleet into attack formation. He had done this so many times that it had stopped feeling like war and started feeling like administration, like a process, like something you completed the way you completed paperwork, methodically and without particular emotion, because it was simply what needed to be done. He had never, in 12 conquests and 30 years of service, looked at a screen showing 16,000 enemy warships arranged in perfect formation between him and his target, and felt the specific sensation he was feeling now. It was not fear. He told himself that clearly and firmly. It was assessment, a military mind encountering new data and processing it correctly. That was all. He studied the tactical display in front of him. The human fleet was not charging. That was the first thing. Every engagement doctrine the Volcae had ever written assumed that a defending force, upon seeing an invading fleet, would either flee or attack. You ran or you fought. Those were the two options that made sense. A fleet that did neither, a fleet that simply rose into position and held it, weapons charged but not firing, perfectly still in the dark, had no entry in any manual Surek had ever read. They were holding a perimeter, a vast, curved line of ships, spread across a volume of space that would have taken his fleet 20 minutes to cross at full burn. Not a wall, more like a net. Every gap in their formation was covered by overlapping fields of fire from adjacent ships. Surek's tactical officer had been running penetration calculations for the past 4 minutes, and had not yet found an approach vector that did not pass through the weapon's range of at least 6 enemy vessels simultaneously. The human woman on the screen had not moved. She was still looking at him with that expression of calm expectation, as though she was waiting for him to finish reading a document she had already read. "You said defended," Surek said. His Volcae came out of her translator without delay. "Your world has no record of a military force. Our survey data is 8 months old. You did not build this in 8 months." "No," the woman said, "we did not." "How long?" 31 years. The bridge was quiet enough that Surek could hear the ventilation system cycling. He looked at his tactical display again. 31 years. He thought about the survey drone that had passed through this system 8 months ago and found nothing. He thought about all the survey drones before it, the long-range passive scans, the electromagnetic monitoring stations the Volcae maintained at the edges of explored space. 31 years of building and not one signal had leaked. Not one drive signature, not one weapons test flash, not one stray transmission. "You hid all of this," he said. "We were motivated," the woman said. "Who are you?" "Rear Admiral Yemi Ademi. I command the Strategic Reserve of the Human Defense Collective." A pause. "You have not told me your name." Surek considered not answering. Then, Fleet Admiral Surek, Voakai's 6th Conquest Armada. Adami nodded slowly. Admiral Surek. I want to be clear with you about something because I think clarity will save a great deal of unnecessary suffering today. She folded her hands on the surface in front of her. We did not build this fleet to chase you. We built it to stop you here at this location, one time. That is its only purpose. If you withdraw now, we will not follow. If you withdraw now, we will never contact your government, we will not publicize this encounter, and we will not pursue any military action against Voakai territory. She looked at him steadily. But if you advance, Admiral, we will stop you, and we will not enjoy doing it. Surek looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his tactical officer, a broad-shouldered veteran named Grath who had been with him for 9 years. Grath met his eyes and gave a very small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Surek understood it perfectly. Grath was not a man who shook his head at things lightly. Surek looked back at the screen. You are 16,000 ships, he said. I have 3,400. Yes. Your ships are larger than mine, on average. Most of them, yes. And you are telling me to leave. I am asking you to leave, Adami said. There is a difference. I want you to choose this, Admiral, not simply do it because you have no other option. You do have another option. You can order your fleet to attack. I will not pretend otherwise. She paused. But I am asking you not to. Surek stood up from his chair. He did this when he needed to think, when the weight of a decision required that he feel his own legs under him. He walked 3 steps to the left and 3 steps back, which was as far as the space between his chair and the forward console allowed. His officers kept their eyes on their stations. They were very well trained. He thought about the Voakai Grand Council, sitting in their chambers on the homeworld, waiting for the conquest report that would come in 6 days once the communications delay was accounted for. He thought about what it would mean to transmit a withdrawal instead of a victory. He thought about what it would mean to transmit nothing at all, because transmitting nothing at all was also an option that had crossed his mind, briefly and darkly. He thought about the 61 worlds. He thought about 600 years of Voakai expansion, the slow, steady, patient accumulation of territory and resource, the building of the hegemony from a single cold planet into a network of 43 systems. He thought about the law carved in stone, consume before you are consumed. He thought about 16,000 warships arranged with calm, unhurried precision between him and the blue planet. He sat back down. Admiral Adami, he said, I require time to consult with my command staff. Of course, she said, I will hold this channel open. He muted the transmission and looked at Grath. Well. Grath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sir, the penetration models are not improving. Their formation coverage is, he stopped. Started again. Sir, I have been running these numbers for 6 minutes and I cannot find a clean approach. Every vector I model takes us through overlapping fire from a minimum of 8 of their vessels simultaneously. He paused once more. And that is assuming they do not adapt their formation as we move, which they will. Their weapons capability. Unknown. We have no engagement data, but drive signatures suggest power outputs 3 to 4 times greater than our equivalent class vessels. Grath folded his large hands on the console. Sir, I think she is telling the truth. I think they built this fleet specifically for this moment. Why? Surek said, not rhetorically. He genuinely wanted to understand it. Why would a species spend 30 years and every resource they have building a fleet they intend to use only once, only defensively, only here? Nobody on the bridge answered. The question sat in the air. Thesek at her station thought about the Pelhari. She had read about them, the way all Voakai children read about them, briefly, in a chapter of a school text titled The 41 Acquisitions. 1 paragraph. The Pelhari had been in that paragraph. She had not thought about them since she was 10 years old. She thought about them now. She did not say anything. The consultation lasted 22 minutes. Surek's senior staff were divided. 3 of them argued for withdrawal. The numbers were too bad. The tactical position was indefensible, and the hegemony would survive one failed conquest. 3 argued for attack. The Volcae had never retreated from a prey world, and the precedent of retreat would be more dangerous than any military loss. The hegemony's authority rested on the certainty of its advance. A civilization that turned back once would find that every subsequent target knew it was possible to turn them back. Grath said nothing during the debate. He sat at his station and looked at his screens. The 7th senior officer, the ship's physician, was not supposed to be in strategic consultations and had been included by accident when Surek had said all senior staff, and someone had interpreted this literally. She sat in the corner and listened to everything and also said nothing. In the end, Surek made the decision himself, the way he always made decisions. He listened to everyone, he considered what he had heard, and then he chose. He chose wrong. He told himself afterward, in the part of afterward where there was time for telling himself things, that it was not a failure of intelligence. He had the numbers. He had Grath's penetration models. He had Adami's clear and reasonable offer sitting on the transmission log, available for review. He had every piece of information a rational commander needed to make the correct decision. What he did not have was 31 years of watching a species like the Pelhari disappear from the galaxy and feeling, in the specific wordless way that drives a civilization to hollow out its own oceans and fill them with warships, that this must never happen again. He did not have that. He could not have it. It was not available to him. And so, because he was a man who had never lost, and because he had been taught since birth that prey worlds did not fight back, and because some part of him still believed, despite everything his sensors were telling him, that this had to be a bluff, because no prey world had ever not been a prey world, he unmuted the channel, looked at Adami's calm face on his screen and said, "All wings advance." What happened next lasted 47 minutes. It was not a battle in any way that the word usually implies. There was no chaos. There was no fog of war, no confusion, no moment where the outcome was genuinely in doubt. The human fleet did not scramble or react. It did not shift formation in response to the Volcae advance the way a force does when it is surprised by an enemy decision. It shifted formation the way a force does when it has been waiting for a specific enemy decision and has spent years preparing the response to it. The Volcae forward squadrons, 1,200 ships moving in a standard wedge formation, the same formation that had opened every one of the 61 conquests, crossed the perimeter line and met a wall of fire that was not like anything in their tactical database. Human point defense systems were extraordinarily precise. This was something the Volcae would not fully understand until much later, when they had time to analyze the engagement data and reconstruct what had happened ship by ship. The precision was not an accident or a technological coincidence. It was the result of 31 years of engineers specifically designing weapons to do one very particular thing: stop ships without killing the people inside them. The reasoning behind this decision was not tactical. It was the second of the 3 agreements made in that room in Geneva 31 years ago, the one about not building an empire. You do not build an empire with weapons designed to incapacitate rather than destroy. You build a door. Drive systems went dark. Navigation arrays shorted out. Power relays were hit with such specific accuracy that ship after ship in the Volcae forward line lost propulsion and weapons capability, while life support and communications remained intact. Crews found themselves sitting in ships that could not move and could not fire but could breathe and could talk and could, if they chose to, open a channel and ask for help. The Volcae ships that attempted to fire back found their shots absorbed or deflected by shielding configurations they had never seen before. Several shots did land. 3 human ships took significant damage. One lost a section of its hull and 12 crew members died in the decompression before the emergency bulkhead sealed. Their names were recorded. Surek watched the forward squadrons go dark one by one on his tactical display. Not explosions, he would have understood explosions. Just gone. Offline. Drifting. 1,200 ships, reduced in 47 minutes to a field of silent hulls tumbling gently in the dark. He sat very still in his command chair. Adami's voice came through the open channel. She had not closed it during the engagement. She had watched the entire thing from her command center with the channel open, and her face on Surek's screen had not changed its expression once. "Admiral," she said quietly, "I need you to stand down your remaining fleet." Surek looked at his tactical display. 2,200 ships still combat capable. Against what remained of the human formation, which had lost perhaps 40 vessels from the entire engagement and had already closed ranks over the gaps. He thought about the law, consume before you are consumed. He thought about 1,200 ships full of his people, drifting. He looked at Adami. "If I stand down," he said, "what happens to my crews?" "They receive medical attention if needed, food and water, and safe return to Volkai space," Adami said. "All of them, everyone." Surek's jaw tightened. "You would return them." "We are not in the business of prisoners," she said. "We never planned to be." He was quiet for a moment. On his screen behind Adami, he could see her staff moving between consoles. They were not celebrating. Not a single person in that room was celebrating. They looked tired and serious, and one of them, a young woman near the back, appeared to be quietly crying, though she was still working. Surek had seen celebrating soldiers after a victory. He had been a celebrating soldier after a victory. He had never seen a winning force that looked like this. "Why is she crying?" he said before he could stop himself. Adami glanced back briefly. She seemed to understand exactly who he meant without looking for long. She turned back to him. "Because 12 of my people died today," she said, "and because 640 of yours are in medical distress aboard disabled ships, and we are working to get to them." She paused. "And probably because she hoped, the way we all hoped, that this would not be necessary." Surek looked at the tactical display for the last time. Then he reached forward and pressed the fleet-wide broadcast key and said, in a voice that was very steady, "All Volkai vessels, stand down, weapons to safe, await further orders." The channel was very quiet for a moment after that. "Thank you, Admiral," Adami said. Surek sat back in his chair. He felt very tired. He felt something else too, something he did not have a word for in his language. A feeling that was not quite shame and not quite relief and not quite the beginning of understanding, but was somewhere in the space between all three. "Admiral Adami," he said, "I have a question." "Yes." "You said you built this fleet to stop us here one time, defensively." He looked at her. "What happens after today? We still exist. The hegemony still exists. What stops us from going home, building more ships, and returning in 20 years? Adami was quiet for a moment, not because she did not have an answer. From the look on her face, Surek had the impression she had been expecting this question for a long time and had thought carefully about how to answer it. "Nothing," she said simply. "Nothing stops you if that is what your people decide to do." She paused. "But before you go home, Admiral, I would like to show you something, and I would like you to take it back with you and show it to whoever makes that decision." She looked at him directly. "Will you allow that?" Surek studied her face. "What is it?" he said. "A dictionary," she said. He did not understand. He could tell from her expression that she knew he did not understand, and that she intended to explain, and that the explanation was going to take some time, and that she believed, genuinely believed, that once he understood it, he would think differently about 20 years from now. He did not know yet if she was right. But he said, "Yes, I will allow it." On the screens behind him, the Volkai fleet held its position in the dark, standing down, waiting. Around the blue planet, 14,000 human ships held their own positions, steady and quiet, like something that had been waiting a very long time to stand exactly where it was standing. The void was very still. The disabled Volkai ship had a name. It was called the Steadfast Blade, which was the kind of name that sounded very confident when you were moving through deep space at the head of a conquest fleet, and considerably less so when you were drifting sideways through the dark with no working engines and a crack in your portside hull that the emergency sealant foam was holding together through what felt, to the crew inside, like pure stubbornness and hope. There were 214 Volkai on the Steadfast Blade. Most of them were in the lower decks, away from the hull crack, sitting on the floor or leaning against walls in the particular way that people sit and lean when they are frightened, and there is nothing useful to do, and moving around feels like a waste of the air that is slowly becoming precious. The emergency life support had kicked in when the main power went down, but emergency life support on a warship was designed for short-term survival, not for comfort, and the temperature had dropped 11 degrees in the 2 hours since the engagement ended. A young weapons operator named Vesk sat with her back against a coolant pipe, not because the pipe was warm, it wasn't, but because it was solid and she needed something solid against her back, and held her personal communicator in both hands and tried to decide what to say. Communicator still worked. The humans, when they had disabled the Steadfast Blade, had taken out propulsion and weapons and the main sensor array and the navigation system and the forward communications relay. They had not taken out the personal communication network, the short-range system that crew members used to call family back home. Whether this was deliberate or accidental, Vesk did not know. She suspected it was deliberate. She did not know why she suspected this. She just did. She had been sitting here for an hour trying to decide what to say to her family, and she still had not worked it out. Her mother was on the homeworld. Her younger brother was doing his first year of technical school. Her father had been dead for 6 years, which was its own kind of grief that she did not think about often, but was thinking about right now because when you are sitting in a cold, dark ship that might or might not hold together for another 12 hours, you think about the people you cannot call. She could call her mother. She could call her brother. She had the codes memorized. All she had to do was press the connect button and wait the standard 40-second communication delay, and one of them would answer because they always answered, because they were that kind of family. She did not know what she would say to them. She did not know how to say, "I am on a disabled ship in the defended space of a species we came here to destroy, and they are choosing not to destroy us back. And I am sitting here thinking about everything I was taught about prey worlds, and I am not sure any of it was right. And I am cold, and I am alive, and I do not fully understand why I am alive because from everything I was taught, the species on that blue planet below me should not have the capacity for mercy, and yet the evidence suggests they do." She could not fit all of that into a call home. She pressed the connect button and listened to the delay tone, and when her mother's voice came through, tired and familiar and immediately worried, Vesk said simply, "I am alive. I am okay. I will explain everything when I get home." Her mother said, "When?" Vesk looked at the cold ceiling of the lower deck. "Soon," she said. "I think soon." She did not know yet that she was right. She did not know that 3 hours from now, a human rescue craft, broad and flat and ugly in the utilitarian way of things, built to work rather than to look good, would lock its docking collar onto the Steadfast Blade's emergency airlock, and a team of 8 humans in environment suits would come through carrying portable heating units, oxygen supplement canisters, medical kits, and enough food and water for 3 days. She did not know that the first human through the airlock would look at the 214 cold and frightened Volkai sitting on the floor of the lower deck, and would stand there for just a moment taking in the scene, and would then do something that no Volkai on that ship would have predicted in any of the long frightened hours they had spent waiting. She would take off her helmet, clip it to her belt, and say in badly accented but completely recognizable Volkai, "I am here. You are safe. We are going to take care of you." And then she would begin unpacking the heating units. Her name was Specialist Dara Okonkwo, and she was 26 years old, and she had been training for this specific mission, rescue and care of disabled enemy crew, for 4 years, which told you something about the kind of organization the Human Defense Collective was, and the kinds of things it had thought about in the 31 years it had spent preparing for this day. Dara had not expected to feel what she felt when she came through that airlock. She had trained for the tactical realities of the situation, the environmental conditions, the communication protocols, the medical assessment procedures for Volkai physiology, which was different enough from human physiology that the medics in her team had spent 2 years specifically studying it. She had trained for hostile responses, for panic, for the possibility that some of the crew would attempt to resist the boarding, even though the ship was dead in the water and resistance would accomplish nothing. She had protocol for all of it. She had not trained for the way they looked at her. 214 sets of Volkai eyes, large, yellow-irised, capable of seeing into spectrums that human eyes could not, all turning toward her at once, not with hostility, with something she recognized because she was a person and they were people, and there were not that many expressions that did not translate across species lines. They looked at her the way anyone looks at someone who has just arrived in the place where they were afraid and alone. They looked relieved. She felt something move in her chest that was not part of any training protocol. She got to work. Her team spread out through the lower decks, distributing heat and light and food with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this many times. The Volkai crew, to their visible surprise, were not separated, not restrained, not moved to holding areas. They were treated where they sat. The medics moved person to person with scanner and kit, checking for decompression exposure, for hypoxia, for the specific circulatory vulnerabilities that Volkai physiology developed in cold environments. They found 14 cases serious enough to require immediate treatment. They treated all 14. Dara found herself sitting on the floor next to a young Volkai who appeared to be in her early 20s, young, by any standard, who was holding a personal communicator and staring at it with an expression of complicated exhaustion. Dara looked at the communicator. She looked at the young woman's face. "Did you get through?" Dara said in Volkai. Her accent was genuinely bad. She knew it was bad. She said it anyway. The young woman looked at her with surprise, not at the question but at the language. "Yes," she said slowly, "my mother." "Good," Dara said. "That's good." They sat in silence for a moment. The heating unit 3 meters away was beginning to make a difference, and the air was incrementally less thin as the oxygen supplement cycled through the deck. "Why are you doing this?" the young woman said. Dara thought about the answer. Not because she did not have one, she had thought about this question, had expected some version of it, had turned it over in her head during the long training years. She thought about it because she wanted to give the right answer, not just the prepared one. "Because you are alive," she said finally, "and keeping you alive is the right thing to do." The young woman, whose name Dara would learn later, was Vesk, looked at her for a long moment with those large yellow eyes. "We came here to destroy your world," Vesk said, not defiantly, just as a statement of fact offered carefully, the way you offer something when you are not sure what receiving it will cost you. "I know," Dara said. "And you are still," Vesk started again, "you are giving us food." "Yes." "Why?" Dara looked at the heating unit. She thought about the Pelhari. She thought about the chapter in her school history that had not been a paragraph but an entire year of study, a curriculum built around learning everything recoverable about a species that no longer existed, so that the people who might one day face their destroyers would understand in their bones exactly what was at stake. "Because someone should have done it for others," she said, "and didn't." Vesk did not understand this entirely. Dara could see that she did not understand it entirely. But she nodded slowly, the way you nod when something lands in you at a level below full comprehension, when the meaning has not yet reached the surface but something underneath has already recognized it. Dara stood up and went back to work. Tucked into the side pocket of her environment suit, beneath the medical scanner and the emergency patch kit and the small translation device clipped to her collar, was a folded piece of paper. It was not standard equipment. It had been placed there by the same linguist who had prepared emergency phrase cards in 17 Volkai dialects for every rescue team in the fleet. A small, careful woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had worked in the Pelhari Reconstruction Archive for 20 years, and had quietly added this task to her responsibilities when the activation orders came, because she felt it mattered. The paper was a card, simple, handwritten in a language that was not Volkai and not human. At the top of the card, in careful letters, was a phrase in Pelhari. Below it was a Volkai translation, and below that a note in small handwriting that said, "In case they ask about this, tell them it means, we see you." Dara had read the card many times. She had not yet had occasion to use it. She folded it back into her pocket and kept working. In the buried command center in the Nigerian highlands, Rear Admiral Ademi sat in her chair and watched the rescue operation unfold across 47 screens. The screens showed her different things. Thermal readings of the disabled Volkai ships, ticking slowly upward as rescue teams got heating units inside. Medical status reports, updated in real time as the fleet medics worked through the drifting hulls. Communication logs from the Volkai fleet, which her signals team was monitoring, not to intercept military data, but to track crew welfare, to know when life support stabilized, to know if any ship was in danger of losing pressure before a rescue team could reach it. The operation was going well. Better than the simulations had predicted, actually. The Volkai crews, once they understood that the humans boarding their ships were not there to harm them, had been largely cooperative. Several had actively helped pointing out where the heating needed to go, showing the medics which crew members were in the worst condition, assisting with the manual operation of airlocks whose power systems were offline. Ademi watched all of this and felt tired in the specific way. She felt tired when something enormous and difficult was going more or less right. She thought about the 12 names on the list her aide had placed quietly on the desk beside her an hour ago. 12 human crew members who had died when a Volkai shot landed on the destroyer Abuja's Promise during the engagement. The Abuja's Promise had lost a section of its rear hull. The 12 had been in that section. She knew all 12 names. She had made it a rule years ago, when she had first taken command of the Quiet, that she would memorize the names of every person under her command. 14,862 ships, hundreds of thousands of crew members. She could not memorize all of them, but she had memorized every name on every command roster of every ship in her immediate operational group, and she had required every admiral under her to do the same for their groups. It was a small thing. It was the least possible thing. She did it anyway. She looked at the 12 names. Then she looked at the screens showing the rescue operation. Volkai crew members receiving food. Volkai crew members having injuries treated. Volkai crew members sitting in warming lower decks looking at human rescue workers, with expressions that the facial recognition software on her system was flagging, somewhat uncertainly, as confusion and possible recalibration. She thought about what Surek had asked her. What stops us from going home, building more ships, and returning in 20 years? Nothing, she had told him, and that was true. But she had also told him she wanted to show him something, and that part was also true, and that part mattered more than anything else that had happened today. The fleet could win a battle. What happened after the battle was the part that determined whether the battle meant anything. She reached across her desk and picked up a thin data case. Inside it was a storage drive. On the storage drive was 20 years of work by Dr. Yuki Tanaka and her team at the Pelhari Reconstruction Archive. Every fragment of Pelhari language recovered from long-range recordings. Every image reconstruction from the telescope data gathered in the years before and after the Volcae destroyed them. Every piece of music recovered from their broadcast signals, partial, fragmented, incomplete, but real. Every transmission between Pelhari individuals captured by humanity's deep space listening arrays, translated and cataloged and preserved. The complete record of a people who no longer existed, assembled by another people who had decided that existing was not enough, that being remembered was also necessary, and that the act of remembering was itself a kind of resistance. She set the case back on the desk and opened the channel to Surek's flagship. He answered quickly. He had, she thought, been waiting. "Admiral," she said, "how are your crews?" A pause. "Your people are taking care of them," he said. "I have been watching the feeds." Another pause. "They are being treated well." "Yes. I did not expect that." "I know." Surek was quiet for a moment. On the screen behind him, his bridge crew were at their stations, subdued, doing the quiet work of a fleet that has stood down after a loss. They looked tired. They looked like people who were thinking very hard about things they had not thought about before. "You mentioned something you wanted to show me," Surek said. "Yes." Adami looked at the data case on her desk. "Before I do, I want to tell you something about why we built the fleet, the real reason, not the tactical reason." She looked at him. "Have you heard of the Pelhari?" A long pause, longer than the communication delay accounted for. "Yes," Surek said. "They are in our records, an acquisition 40 years ago." "An acquisition," Adami repeated, not with anger, just letting the word sit in the air. "We watched it happen from here. We saw the light of their world go dark." She paused. "We had never met them. We did not know them. But we had been listening to their transmissions for 20 years by then, and we had been learning their language and we knew their names." She stopped. "Not all of them, but some of them." Surek said nothing. "We built the fleet because of them," Adami said. "Not for revenge, not for politics, because we could not save them and we decided we would save ourselves, and in saving ourselves we would at least make sure there was someone left in this galaxy who knew their name." She picked up the data case and held it toward the camera. "This is 30 years of reconstruction work," she said. "Their language, their music, their recorded transmissions, everything we could recover." She set it down. "I am going to transmit a copy of this to your flagship. I want you to take it home. I want someone in the hegemony to read it." She looked at him steadily. "Not as a political gesture, not as a condition of anything, just because they existed and they should be known." The silence on the channel lasted a long time. Then Surek said, in a voice that was somewhat different from the voice he had been using for the rest of the conversation, quieter, with something in it that Adami's translator did not have a precise word for but that she recognized nonetheless. What was their word for themselves? The Pelhari. What did they call their own world? Adami looked at him for a moment. Then she opened a file on her desk console and found the word and read it aloud, carefully, in Pelhari. It was a soft word, 2 syllables. It meant the warm place. Surek repeated it quietly, in his own voice, without the translator. It did not sound the same in Volcae, but he said it anyway. Adami watched him say it and felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Not relief, not victory. Something smaller and more durable than either of those things. Something that felt, in its quiet way, like the beginning of something rather than the end. "I will take it home," Surek said. "Thank you," she said. She closed the channel and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the buried room for a long moment. Then she looked at the screens. The rescue operation was still running. Across the dark, in the drifting hulls of 1,200 disabled ships, Her people were sitting on cold floors next to frightened strangers, distributing heat and food and oxygen, and the complicated, difficult, impractical belief that everyone in this situation deserved to go home. Adami looked at the 12 names on the list again. She thought, it is not enough. It is never going to feel like enough. She thought, but it is what we can do, and we did it. She picked up the red handset. There were calls to make, reports to file. The work of after was beginning, and the work of after was going to be long and complicated and would require everything she had left. She began to make the calls. On the screens around her, in the dark between the stars, the rescue ships kept moving. The Volkai diplomatic envoy arrived at the edge of the Sol system 11 weeks later. It came alone, one ship, a mid-sized vessel, unarmed, painted white on its forward hull in a color that the Volkai used for ceremonial occasions, births, deaths, the signing of agreements between equals. The choice of white was significant. The hegemony had never painted a ship white for a journey to a prey world before, because prey worlds were not equals and there had never been agreements to sign. The fact that someone in the Grand Council had made the decision to paint the ship white before anyone had formally agreed that there would be a meeting said something about the state of mind in the hegemony after Surek came home. His return had not gone the way returns usually went. Usually, a fleet admiral coming back from a conquest was met with ceremony. The docking bay of the homeworld's primary orbital station would be lined with officials and banners, and a military band that played the hegemony's expansion anthem, a long and self-congratulatory piece of music that everyone stood at attention for and nobody particularly enjoyed. The admiral would walk down the docking ramp and shake hands, and give a brief statement about the new acquisition and the resources it would provide to the hegemony's continued growth. And then there would be a formal dinner, and then the real administrative work of integrating the new world would begin. Surek had come home without a conquest. He had come home with 3,400 ships, most of them intact, and with 1,200 crews who had been treated well by the enemy and sent back unharmed, and who were now talking, quietly and persistently, to everyone they knew. And he had come home with a data drive that he had given directly to the Grand Council without explanation in the first closed-door session after his arrival, and had then sat quietly while they read what was on it. He had said when they asked him what it was, "It is the record of something we did 40 years ago. I think we should know what we did." The session had lasted 9 hours. Surek had not been invited to all of it. He had sat in an anteroom and waited, and when they had finally called him back in, the council members had looked different from when he had left. Not shaken exactly. The Grand Council of the Volkai hegemony was not in the habit of appearing shaken, but something had moved behind their eyes. Something had shifted in the room, the way the air shifts in a space when a window is opened for the first time in a long time. One of the senior council members, an old woman named Vraxa, who had been on the council for 40 years and had presided over 11 of the 61 acquisitions, had looked at Surek across the long table and said, "This species, the humans, they built a fleet of 16,000 warships and they did not come after us." "No," Surek said. "They could have." "Yes." Vraxa had been quiet for a moment. Why didn't they? Surek had thought about Adami's face on the screen. He had thought about the rescue teams coming through the airlocks of his disabled ships with heating units and food. He had thought about the card that one of his crew members, a young weapons operator named Vesk, who had written a detailed personal account of her experience aboard the Steadfast Blade and submitted it, unusually, directly to Fleet Command rather than through standard channels, had described in her account. A card with words written in a dead language, words that meant, "We see you." "I think," Surek said carefully, "that they did not come after us because coming after us was not the point." Nobody in the room had said anything for a while after that. The diplomatic envoy's ship was called the Open Hand. This was also new. Volkai warships were named after concepts of force and inevitability, the eternal dominion, the steadfast blade, the unbroken advance. A ship called the Open Hand had no precedent in the hegemony's naming registry. Someone had had to create a new category for it in the database. The clerk who had processed the registration had stared at the entry for a long time before filing it. The envoy herself was a woman named Counselor Dresch. She was 60 years old, slim and precise, with the particular manner of someone who had spent a career in rooms where the wrong word caused serious problems, and had therefore become very careful about words. She had not been on any of the conquest fleets. She had spent her professional life in the hegemony's internal administrative systems, managing resource allocation and intercolony trade disputes, which was unglamorous work that nobody celebrated, but that kept the hegemony functioning. She had read the Pelhari file 3 times before accepting this assignment. She had accepted it anyway, because when Vraxa had asked her personally, she had not been able to think of a reason to say no that she could respect. She was met at the human orbital station by a small delegation of 3 people. The first was Rear Admiral Adami, who looked exactly as Dresch had expected from the recordings, calm, precise, with an economy of movement that suggested someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy on anything that wasn't necessary. The second was a man named Minister Callum Park, who represented the UN Emergency Council, and had the slightly glazed expression of a politician who had been briefed and rebriefed so many times that the information had stopped feeling real. The third was a small, quiet woman in a plain gray jacket who was introduced simply as Dr. Yuki Tanaka, archive specialist, and who carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder that clinked faintly when she moved, in the way that bags clank when they contain objects that have been carried for a long time. Dresch shook hands with all 3, because she had studied human greeting customs, and they sat down in a room that was not large or decorated, just a conference room with a long table and chairs and a window that looked out at the black, and somewhere below it, the edge of the blue planet's curve. Minister Park opened the meeting with a prepared statement about mutual respect and peaceful coexistence, and the importance of dialogue between civilizations, which Dresch listened to politely, and which contained nothing she had not already read in the preliminary communication documents. She waited for it to finish. Then Adami spoke, and her statement was much shorter. "We have one condition," she said. "One thing we are asking the hegemony to agree to. Everything else, trade relationships, diplomatic contact, mutual recognition, we can discuss in time if both sides want to. But there is one condition that is not negotiable, and I want to put it on the table now so we all know what we are here to decide." Dresch folded her hands. "Go ahead." "The hegemony will release every species currently under occupation," Adami said. "All 23 of them. Full withdrawal from their systems, return of seized resources where possible, and cessation of any ongoing operations." She paused. "In exchange, we will not pursue the hegemony militarily. We will not publicize the details of what happened here, and we will not contact the occupied species ourselves or assist them in any retaliatory action. That is our offer." Dresch was quiet for a moment. She had known this was coming. Vraxa had told her to expect it, but hearing it stated plainly was different from reading it in a briefing document. 23 species. The economic and territorial implications were significant enough that 3 separate hegemony administrative departments had filed formal objections, just to the possibility of it before she had even left the homeworld. "The Grand Council will require time to deliberate on the specifics," Dresch said. "Of course," Adami said, "we are not in a hurry. There will be questions about implementation, timelines. The logistics of withdrawal from 23 systems simultaneously is." "We understand logistics," Adami said, not unkindly. "We spent 31 years doing logistics that nobody knew about. We are happy to help plan the process." Dresch looked at her for a moment, then despite herself she said, "Why?" Why help us with it? Because the goal is for it to happen, Adami said simply, not for it to be difficult. Dresh thought about that. She thought about the way the hegemony negotiated, which was to make everything as difficult as possible for as long as possible, until the other side gave up enough concessions to make it worthwhile to agree. She thought about what it meant to sit across from someone who did not seem to be playing that game at all, who seemed, bafflingly, to simply want the agreed-upon outcome to occur. It was disorienting. She decided to move on. You mentioned one condition, Dresh said. Is that the only one, the withdrawal? A small silence. Adami and Tanaka glanced at each other briefly. It was a quick look, the kind exchanged between people who have discussed something many times and have agreed on how it will be handled. Tanaka reached into her worn canvas bag and produced a book. It was a physical book, printed on actual paper, with a cloth cover in deep blue. She set it on the table and slid it across to Dresh. Dresh looked at it. The cover had text on it in two scripts, one she recognized as human, one she did not recognize at all. What language is this? She said, touching the unfamiliar script. Pelhari, Tanaka said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was quiet and precise, the voice of someone who spent most of their time with documents and was comfortable with that. The title in Pelhari means roughly, the warm place remembered. It is a complete reconstructed dictionary of their language, everything we were able to recover. She paused, along with a collection of their recorded transmissions, their music, their personal communications. Another pause. The things they said to each other. Dresh looked at the book. She did not pick it up yet. You mentioned a second condition, she said carefully. Not a condition, Tanaka said. A request. There is a difference. She looked at Dresh directly with small, serious eyes. We would like someone in the hegemony to read it. That is all. Not as an obligation. Not as a formal requirement of the agreement. Just someone should read it. Someone should know their name. Someone on your side should know who they were. The room was very quiet. Dresh looked at the book. She thought about the 9-hour session of the Grand Council, which she had not attended but had been briefed on extensively. She thought about the faces of the council members as described by those who had been there. She thought about Vraxa, who had been on the council for 40 years and had presided over 11 acquisitions, asking Surek why the humans hadn't come after them. She thought about the Pelhari, one paragraph in a school text, an acquisition 40 years ago. She picked up the book. It was lighter than she expected. She opened it to a random page and looked at the script, flowing, curved characters that were nothing like the angular lines of Volkai text. Beside each entry was a pronunciation guide and a translation, and sometimes a usage note explaining the context in which a word was typically used. Some of the usage notes were very specific. One said, used primarily between family members in the evening as a greeting upon returning home. Another said, a term of affection with no precise equivalent. Closest translation is something like the one I think of when I am far away. Dresh read those two entries and then closed the book carefully and set it on the table in front of her. I will read it, she said, personally. Tanaka nodded. There was no triumph in her expression, just the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom this moment represented the completion of something that had taken a very long time. Thank you, Tanaka said. The agreement was signed 14 weeks later, after a negotiating process that was long and complicated, and at several points appeared to be failing and then did not fail, partly because both sides wanted it to work, and partly because Adami had meant what she said about helping with logistics, and had assigned a team of 40 specialists to assist the hegemony's administrative departments with the withdrawal planning, which had surprised everyone on the Volkai side, and had made several of the more intractable procedural disputes significantly easier to resolve. The signing ceremony was simple. No flags, no military bands, A room with a table and chairs and the same window looking out at the black and the curve of the planet below it. Dresh and Adami signed their names in their respective scripts on a document that was 2 pages long and written in plain language that any person on either side could read and understand without legal training, because Adami had insisted on this and had rewritten the first 4 drafts herself until it was right. After the signing, they sat for a while with tea, a human tradition that Dresh had been briefed on and had been slightly skeptical of, but that turned out, on experience, to be reasonable, and they did not talk about the agreement or the fleet or the withdrawal timelines. They talked about other things, small things. Dresh asked about the geology of the planet below them because she was genuinely curious. Adami asked about the Vokai homeworld, what it looked like, what season it was right now. Tanaka sat with her canvas bag and said very little but listened carefully to everything. At one point Dresh said, "The book, I have been reading it in the evenings." She paused. It is a very complete record." 20 years of work, Tanaka said. "The word for the warm place," Dresh said. "Their name for their world, I have been thinking about it." She looked at the window. "We did not know it before, any of us. It was not in any of our records. They were just an acquisition number." She stopped. "It seems wrong that we did not know it." "Yes," Tanaka said, "it is wrong." Dresh nodded slowly. She did not say anything else about it. She did not need to. The fact that she had said it at all, the fact that a senior member of the Vokai Grand Council had sat in a room on a human orbital station and said it is wrong about something the hegemony had done, was, in Tanaka's estimation, worth more than any clause in any agreement. She did not say this out loud. She thought it and set it aside and drank her tea. The news of the agreement, when it was finally released to the public of both species, landed differently in different places. On Earth, there was celebration, the disorganized and genuine kind that happens when something enormous and frightening resolves in a way that allows people to breathe again. Cities had been aware for 11 weeks that something significant was happening, that there had been some kind of contact, that the emergency protocols activated before dawn on a Tuesday had meant something real. The details had been kept back, partly for security, and partly because the UN Emergency Council had wanted the agreement in place before the story was fully told. When it was released, with Adami's full recorded statement and the text of the agreement and a brief history of the program that most people were hearing about for the first time, the reaction was enormous and complicated and went on for weeks. Most people had not known. That was the part that took the longest to absorb. The fleet, the program, the 31 years of building, most people on Earth had lived their entire lives above a planet that was quietly preparing for something they did not know about, and they had not known. Some people were angry about this. The anger was understandable, and Adami had expected it and addressed it directly in her statement, acknowledging that the secrecy had been a choice made by a small number of people on behalf of everyone, and that this required accounting for, and committing to a full public review of how the program had been run and how such decisions should be made in the future. She did not apologize for building the fleet. She apologized for nothing except the weight of the secret, which she acknowledged had been heavy and had been carried by the people inside the program at real personal cost for a very long time. Other people, most people, eventually, felt something that was harder to name. A kind of retrospective vertigo, the knowledge that the world you had been living in was also, simultaneously, a different world. That beneath the cities and the oceans, beneath the ordinary days of your life, something vast and serious and carefully considered had been happening for decades, had been happening because someone had looked at what happened to a species called the Pelhari and had decided that it would not happen here, and had spent 31 years making sure. The Pelhari became known, on Earth, in the weeks after the announcement. Tanaka's archive, which had been classified for 20 years, was released in full, and people read it the way people read things that matter, slowly and at odd hours, in the middle of the night or on lunch breaks or on trains, stopping sometimes to look out the window. The music was particularly widely shared. It was strange music, not human in any of its rhythms or harmonics, and it was fragmentary and incomplete, reconstructed from partial signals. But it was recognizably music. It had the shape of something made by beings who felt things and wanted to express them, and this was enough. The Pelhari's word for their world, the warm place, was added to the record of the agreement as a footnote, at Tanaka's request, in the original Pelhari script alongside the translations. It was a small thing. It was the least possible thing. It was in there. Months after the signing, in a listening station on the edge of explored space, a monitoring system registered something. The station was automated. It had been running for 9 years, sweeping the deep dark for signals, cataloging electromagnetic noise from distant star systems, building the slow and patient picture of who else was out there in the galaxy and what they were doing. It found things occasionally. Usually the things it found were natural pulsars, magnetars, the radio wash of active galactic nuclei. Sometimes it found the faint, ancient light of civilizations so far away that their signals had been traveling for thousands of years, and by the time they arrived, it was impossible to know if the civilization was still there. Occasionally it found something closer, something more recent, something that was clearly artificial, the tight band, structured frequency of a deliberate transmission. The signal the station registered on this particular day had originated from a system approximately 60 light-years away, in a direction that was neither toward the Volkai homeworld nor toward any of the 23 occupied systems currently being processed through the withdrawal agreement. It was a new direction, a system that was not in any current database as inhabited or explored. The signal was short, tight beam directed toward Sol. Someone had aimed it deliberately at Earth. The monitoring system flagged it, packaged it, and sent it through the standard relay to the analysis team on Earth, where it sat in a queue for 3 days before a young analyst named Petra Novick pulled it up on her screen on a Wednesday morning with a cup of coffee and began to work through it. It took her 4 hours to decode. The encoding was not complex. It was, in fact, structured in a way that seemed designed to be decoded without a shared cipher key, which suggested the senders had put thought into making it readable. What was complex was the language itself, which she had never seen before, and which the translation AI had never seen before, and which required a careful structural analysis to parse from first principles. When she finally had a working translation, she sat for a long time looking at her screen. The message was short, 3 sentences. The first sentence said, "We have been watching the light from your system for many years and have been afraid to make contact." The second sentence said, "We saw what happened when the large fleet came, and we saw that you are still here." The third sentence said, "We would like to know if it is safe to say hello." Petra read the message 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called her supervisor. Then she called her supervisor's supervisor. Within an hour, the message was on Adami's desk in the Nigerian highlands, where Adami read it twice and then set it down and looked at the ceiling for a while. She thought about the Pelhari. She thought about the 31 years in the dark. She thought about Dresh sitting across a table saying it is wrong that we did not know their name. She thought about Vesk, the young Volkai weapons operator, sitting on the cold floor of a disabled ship holding a communicator and not knowing what to say, and about Dara Okonkwo coming through the airlock and saying, in bad accented Volkai, "I am here. You are safe." She thought about what the word unprotected meant, what it had meant to the Volkai when they looked at their survey data and saw a world with no orbital weapons and no fleet signatures, what it meant now to whoever had sent this message, looking at Sol from 60 light-years away and wondering if the thing they had watched happen was a thing they could approach. She picked up her pen and pulled a notepad toward her and wrote, in plain language, the beginning of a response. "Yes," she wrote, "it is safe. We are here. Tell us your name." She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she added one more line, because it felt right, because it was the thing she would have wanted someone to say to the Pelhari 40 years ago, and because wanting that and not being able to give it then did not mean she could not give it now. "We have been hoping someone would ask." Across the city, in a small office in a building that had no special markings on it, Dr. Yuki Tanaka sat at her desk surrounded by files and reference materials and the quiet, organized clutter of 20 years of reconstruction work. The Pelhari archive was public now. The work that had defined her career, the slow, patient, sometimes heartbreaking effort of recovering a language word by word from fragments and noise, was no longer classified, no longer known only to the small community of people inside the program. Millions of people had read it. Hundreds of thousands had downloaded the music. She had received a great deal of correspondence in the month since the release. Letters and messages from people all over the world who had read the archive and wanted to say something about it, who needed to express the particular feeling that the Pelhari gave you when you spent time with what remained of them, that mixture of grief and recognition, and the strange sense of obligation that comes from knowing a person, or a people, who can no longer know you back. She read all the correspondence. She answered what she could. On her desk, in a small frame, was a photograph. Not a photograph of a person, a photograph of text. The last recoverable transmission from the Pelhari, sent in the final hours before the Voakai fleet completed its work. It had taken Tanaka 3 years to translate it fully, because the signal had been badly degraded, and several words had required reconstruction from context. But she had it now, and she had looked at it so many times that she did not need to read it from the frame anymore. She had it in her head. The transmission had been sent by a Pelhari individual to another Pelhari individual, a personal message, not a broadcast. It had been caught by Earth's deep space array almost by accident, the signal bouncing off an unusual atmospheric feature that had briefly amplified its reach. The sender's name was not recoverable. The recipient's name was not recoverable. What was recoverable was the message itself. It said, "I am thinking of the water near our house. Do you remember how it sounded in the morning? I want you to know that I remember. I am very glad that I remember." Tanaka had translated this. She had sat with it for a long time. She had then made the decision, which she had not discussed with anyone, to include it as the final entry in the archive. Not in the dictionary section, not in the transmission catalog, but on a page by itself at the very end of the document, after all the scholarly apparatus and footnotes and reconstruction notes. Just the text in the original Pelhari script and the English translation, and below it the date it was sent and the note, sender and recipient unknown. Context, final hours of the Pelhari civilization. She had put it there because she felt that a record of a people should end with a person. Not with a summary, not with an analysis, with a person thinking about water near a house and being glad to remember it. She looked at the photograph on her desk now, in the late afternoon light coming through her office window. She thought about the new signal. Adami had called her this morning to tell her about it, 60 light years away. Someone who had been watching and was afraid and wanted to know if it was safe. Someone who had asked. She thought about what it meant that they had asked. That somewhere out there in the dark was a species that had been keeping quiet, the way humanity had kept quiet, watching and waiting and measuring the temperature of the galaxy, and trying to decide whether the galaxy was safe enough for hello. And they had seen what happened at Sol, and they had decided that maybe it was. She opened a new document on her computer. She did not know yet what language the new signal was in. She did not know yet if she would be assigned to the translation and contact team, though she intended to ask. She did not know yet what the new species called themselves, or their world, or the water near their houses, or the people they thought about when they were far away. but she would learn. That was the work. That had always been the work. Learning the names of things and the words for things and the particular ways that different kinds of minds found to say I am here and I remember and I am glad. She began to type. Outside her window, the sky above the city was the particular blue it gets in the late afternoon when the light is coming from a low angle, and the air is clear. A blue so ordinary and so specific that you could spend your whole life under it and not fully appreciate what it was. Just sky. Just the ordinary sky of a planet that was still here, still turning, still full of people going home in the evenings to houses near water, still making the small sounds of a civilization that had decided, a long time ago and at great cost, that it intended to remain. Dr. Yuki Tanaka typed. The afternoon light moved across her desk. The world turned. Somewhere in the dark, 60 light years away, something waited for an answer. It would get one.